Yes, well, hello once again and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and I hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old school vintage classics. Now, we just managed to unearth another very rare specimen, and this bike that we're just about to look at belongs to Graham Watson, and this featured bike was a machine that Graham's father built a way back in the early 1970s, but it's still a very nice looking bike with a bit of family history behind it. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at Graham's lovely Cheney Triumph Tiger Cub 200. Okay, so this was quite an interesting bike that I came across recently at the 2023 Helsington Classic Scramble, a bike that has quite an intriguing family history behind it as well. So if you'll maybe just stay with me for a few minutes, I'll do my very best to try and fill you in on some of the background of this rare and lovely looking twin shock classic. And so this bike currently belongs to Graham Watson, who's always been involved with all kinds of motorcycles from a very young age, but it was actually Graham's father, David Watson, who got the young Graham interested in motorbikes, because his dad had always built and raced his own bikes at local sand races and grass tracks way back in the day. So it's a little surprise here that David's son Graham then followed in his father's wheel tracks. And as a young boy, Graham's dad was forever building and altering bigger bikes for young Graham to ride, as he did in this case here when he converted this lovely little Triumph Tina scooter by cutting the frame to lower it and then relocating the fuel tank to put it in front of the rider, just like a real motorcycle. But these must have been great days for Graham, having a dad that made motorbikes so that his son could have something to ride and have fun on. And even Graham's dad was certainly a bit of an accomplished racer in his day, because while he was doing his national service in Egypt in the 1940s, he was still riding and racing motorcycles in between doing his bit for his country. So you can see that motorcycles and racing them is a very big part of this family's history, and Graham's continuing the legacy left from his late father to keep up the tradition of having motorbikes as part of their day-to-day routine. Now, as the young Graham got a little older, he continued to ride the various different concoctions of motorcycles that Dad had constructed for him, and he was now just about old enough to take part in the then popular Schoolboy scrambling scene, which was a very big deal in the early 1970s across the UK. And Graham got himself started by riding a converted Suzuki 80 that was once again re-engineered by Graham's dad, David. Now, as I remember from that Schoolboy era of the 1970s, the rules regarding the size and cc of machine that you could ride were that you could race a two-stroke bike up to, I think it was 175cc, or you could also race a 200cc four-stroke instead. And as there wasn't many small four-stroke motors around at that time, it was predominantly a British-made BSA Bantam, or maybe even a small Suzuki or other equivalent bike that you would choose as your race machine. And as we've just mentioned, Graham's dad David was a very handy motorcycle builder, and he was always convinced that he could build a much better handling bike with a better engine than what was currently available at Schoolboy level. So the seeds were certainly well and truly planted in David's head, and now the search was on to first find a suitable chassis to begin the project. And while Graham's dad continued to chart his son's rise through the Schoolboy ranks, he continued to scrutinise meticulously many of the bikes that were on the track at these at Schoolboy events, and to say the least, he really wasn't that impressed with what he saw, which of course brings us right back to our featured machine. Because as the months passed, Graham's dad just happened to come across an advert in the local motorcycle news publication, which was advertising a quite unique cantilever frame that was built by Eric Cheney of Cheney Motorcycles. Now, the vendor who was selling the frame said that it was part of a batch of 3 chassis that were made by Eric Cheney back in 1973, although after an initial shakedown and test, Eric Cheney decided that, well, maybe these frames weren't all that he expected them to be, so he just decided to shelve the cantilever project for the time being. Now, apparently the initial problem with the cantilever design was that Cheney just couldn't get the rear end of the frame to work right, and it was about 12 months later on when they were then approached by the Girling Suspension Company, who had just made a brand new design of gas and oil shocks, which the Cheney engineers thought might just work on their old cantilever frame. And when they eventually tried the new shocks out on the cantilever frame, it totally transformed the entire handling of the chassis. So to cut a long story slightly shorter, Graham's dad did eventually get his hands on one of these rare Cheney prototype chassis, and now he could begin putting the vision of building his son a bike that could take on the run-of-the-mill Schoolboy machines that were currently available in the 1970s. So Graham's dad now had his chassis and of course a vision of what the eventual project was going to look like, and he just so happened to have a decent pair of beater forks lying around his workshop, so naturally he was going to make very good use of those on the front end of this prototype Cheney frame. But of course there were many other parts to find if this project was going to see the light of day, so Graham and his dad then made a trip to Michael Mann, Bill Brown's dealership, where he kindly invited them both just to have a rummage around his miscellaneous parts bins and just help themselves to whatever they needed. And after a few minutes digging around, they came away with a quite nice looking alloy fuel tank, front and rear wheels, a pair of mudguards and various other little motorcycle trinkets that would help on the build of the bike. So certainly the basis of a rolling chassis was now taking shape, but of course without a power plant, this particular vision was dead in the water. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for the 1970s Schoolboy scrambles bikes, you could either have a 2-stroke 175 or maybe a 200cc 4-stroke motor. And at that time, there were really only 2 options in the 4-stroke department. It was either going to be a BSA C15 or maybe a little Triumph Tiger Cub 200. But of course, the C15 motor was a 250, so it would have to be sleeved down to make it into a 200. So that basically only left one option for Graham's dad, a Triumph Tiger Cub power plant. And as luck would have it, Graham's dad found this particular one in a breaker's yard in Preston. So naturally, the first thing to do with this engine was that it had to be completely stripped down to find out what it was like internally. And the prognosis wasn't really that good, as it did need lots of new parts. So Graham's dad decided to start scouring the bike magazines for bits and pieces, and he even sent letters out to potential suppliers to see what they had. But of course you have to remember that these were the days before the internet, when we can now just get parts at the click of a button. Although eventually Graham's dad did find a brand new piston, oil pump, barrel and cylinder head, and a new electronic ignition, plus all of the other parts that were required to enable the motor to be reconstructed. And once again, Graham's dad put his engineering skills to very good use by converting the motor's barrel to run on methanol rather than regular petrol, because of course methanol, it does make the engine run slightly cooler, it increases the power, and it also prevents things like pre-ignition or pinking, as they sometimes called it. But as you can see from this converted barrel and cylinder head, Graham's dad David was certainly very skilled when it come to wielding the spanners. So it was suffice to say that when the engine was finished, it was like a brand new motor, and it was just a case of Graham's dad then fabricating brand new engine mounts on that Cheney frame before slotting in a little Tiger Cub motor and then connecting everything up prior to its starting. Now, just to make sure that that Tiger Cub motor lined up with the chassis and rear wheel, Graham's dad then used a Greaves Cush drive hub, which he then built onto the rear wheel and then spoked it with the correct offset just to keep everything lined up and in its place. And it was proper old school steel chromed rims that were used, and not the lighter alloy units that we're more familiar with. Now, as you know, many of the other Eric Cheney built frames used the chassis as the motor's storage tank, although again Graham's dad David has relocated the bike's air filter on this bike so that he could fit an external oil tank instead of using the chassis, which by using this system is much more easily accessible for the likes of topping up with oil and any maintenance that's required. But certainly this Cantilever Cheney frame is very unique with this twin shock suspension arrangement here at the back, which is very reminiscent of the German Kramer bikes of the 1980s, who used a very similar arrangement on their 250 and 410 Kramer machines. But this rear suspension layout was basically the reason that Cheney shelved these cantilever frames, because they just couldn't get the rear end to work properly, as it just kept bouncing around all over the track during testing. Although after they bolted on a decent pair of quality shocks, it certainly transformed the handling of this cantilever chassis, which of course then led to Cheney reviving their cantilever frames, where they say they went on to produce a much larger version of this chassis that would accept the larger Honda 250 or 350 XL motors. And it's also said that around 20 or so units were made, which allegedly were all sold around Europe, with maybe one or two even being found in the USA. Now, the exhaust pipe and tail cone is yet another one of the parts that Graham has added to the bike down the years. Again, this part here is more than likely been borrowed from some other make and model of motorcycle, but certainly this nice looking tailpipe is a recent fitment, just to keep the sound of that little 200 Tiger Cub motor to a decent level when it's passing through scrutineering prior to putting the bike out there on the track. Now, as far as I'm aware, this lovely alloy fuel tank was yet another one of the parts that Graham and his dad found when they were raking through Bill Brown's miscellaneous parts bins when they were collecting bits and pieces to build the bike. And these rear and The front mudguards are still the self-same items that the guys found at Bill Brown's workshop all those years ago. Again, from which make and model of bike I don't have a clue, but they've certainly survived very well since the initial build of this bike, which was way back in the early 1970s. Although the colour, of course, may not be to everybody's liking. But I'm pretty sure that the bike's cockpit controls have been changed since the 1970s, as these kind of cables and grips, etc., do get worn out pretty quickly through time, which, as you know, is very common on an off-road bike. But one recent item is, of course, an engine cut-off switch, which is usually now a legal requirement when you're taking part in any kind of enduro or classic scrambles event here in the UK. So this red engine cutout switch will be very handy if there's any problems with that little Tiger Cub motor. And once again we have what looks like a nice comfortable seat on Graham's Cheney Cub, so there should be enough padding in there to help soak up some of the bigger bumps that he'll encounter on the racetrack. But there's certainly something about an old classic dirt bike that's made from steel and alloy, and when you have the combination of those alloy fuel tanks and side panels with that chromed frame and wheels, it almost epitomises what an old school race bike looked like way back in the day. So just to sum up what we have here with this machine, it's basically made up of a 1973 Cheney Cantilever chassis, and the motor is your 1964 Triumph Tiger Cub 200cc 4-stroke power plant that's been slightly modified to run on methanol rather than regular gas. And by all accounts, this little four-banger was certainly quick enough to take on those two-stroke Schoolboy bikes when Graham raced it in the 1970s. And when Graham raced this bike at the 2023 Helsington Scramble, it was all the more poignant because Graham's late father David actually raced at this very first Helsington Scramble event way back in 1952. So it was without doubt a welcome return to see another one of the Watson family take to the track in memory of his late father, who of course had the vision and the skills to put this rare little bike together. And in this nice family picture here, we can see Graham in the centre there with his dad and bike builder David on the right, and Graham's eldest son James on the left. But of course not forgetting little Finlay there sitting on the bike seat, and who knows, he may even be the next family member to continue the Watson legacy for building and racing motorcycles. Although down the years it's pretty fair to say that Graham's had some great times on this Cheney framed Tiger Cub, and it's great that he's continuing to use and appreciate the bike and all of the hard work and initial vision that his dad had to put the bike together in the first place. And Graham's always maintained that it was his dad's enthusiasm for motorcycles that actually got him interested in bikes at a very early age, and I'm pretty sure that Graham would love to dedicate this quite unique Cheney Cub to the man who he says was his best friend, father, and the man who shaped most of his adult life, David Watson. So there you have it, another super rare machine with that Cheney Cantilever chassis, and of course the lovely 4-stroke Triumph Tiger Cub 200 power plant. A bike made up from a British frame and engine, beater forks, a Greaves rear wheel, and of course various other parts from different makes and models of motorcycles. But the amazing thing about this entire project is that it all seems to fit together perfectly.